You were never supposed to hear this. Not from me, not from anyone, not unless you were already marked. But here you are, listening, because some part of you knows that history is not what you were taught. It's what was hidden, buried, and in the case of the Ashford family, sealed behind stone walls drenched in screams. Ask yourself something. Why does pain echo across time louder than triumph? Why do certain names vanish from textbooks, yet linger in whispers, in dreams, in bloodlines? The Ashfords were not simply a religious sect. They were architects of control, masters of obedience. Women who learned to remake the mind, not through faith, but through force disguised as salvation. In the frozen woodlands of 18th century Maine, where no man could hear a woman scream past the trees, they built a sanctuary for healing. That's what the public believed. That's what the clergy believed. That's what the mothers and husbands and judges wanted to believe. Because the truth would fracture what little order America still held on to. Over 600 women entered the Convent of Eternal Tears. Fewer than half returned. Those who did came back, altered. Not cleansed, not healed, but empty. Their souls erased with surgical precision. One witness, a boy named Thomas, saw what should have never been seen. Not through superstition, not through metaphor, but with his own eyes. He saw the rituals, the operations, the control systems. He watched a woman scream as her skull was opened, her will drained like fluid from a pipe. Not by madwomen, but by experts. By disciples of something far older than Christianity, older than Europe. This is not the story of a haunted building. This is the story of design, of an experiment in obedience, perfected through pain. This is the story of the Ashford women and the legacy of their mind-breaking techniques that ripple into psycho, logi, psychiatry, religion, and the education of your children today. You will want to look away. You will feel it in your stomach before your mind catches up. That sense that something sacred has been violated. Good, that's how you know it's real, because from this point on you are not watching a video, you are being initiated.
The Ashfords arrived in Milbridge like holy women, but their presence felt surgical. Agatha, the Mother Superior, sharp-featured, statuesque, educated in the old world, spoke like a queen among peasants. Prudence, her sister, moved like a knife, pale, silent, hands unnaturally still. Then there was Temperance, the youngest, too beautiful, too calm, too untouched by the wildness of the frontier. They claimed to be Anglican nuns, refugees from persecution, but the papers they carried were forged, the church seals faked, the testimonials ghost-written. And yet no one questioned them. Why? Because they paid well, in gold, heavy old-world coins that shimmered like relics from a forgotten empire, the kind of currency that buys silence and complicity. They bought 200 acres of land in a forest untouched by axes, land the local Wabanaki tribes called Nalakek Wihkwam, the place where voices don't return. They built fast. 3 stories of grey stone, windowless at ground level. The windows that did exist sat too high to see from the outside. And below all of it, deep into the bedrock, they carved out something more ancient than a basement. Not storage, not a chapel, a theatre, not for plays, but for procedures. The locals called it a convent, but its architecture said otherwise. Heavy doors, bolted, reinforced. Drainage systems large enough to handle more than water. Ventilation shafts that echoed like hospital corridors. They told the workers it was for intensive prayer. They told the deacon it was for spiritual isolation. But no one asked why a convent needed floor drains and shackles. And when the work was done, when the stone stood tall and cold, the Ashfords locked the front gates and changed the town of Milbridge forever. The women who entered through that gate were rarely seen again. And if they were not who they had been. They moved different. They spoke differently, looked through people instead of at them. Their laughter, once so full, became silence. Their opinions, once dangerous, became obedience. You may think this sounds like superstition, like some backwoods ghost tale,
But I ask you, who benefits when a rebellious woman becomes a submissive wife? Who profits when a fiery girl returns home with no fire in her eyes? This wasn't spiritual reform. It was psychological reset. The Ashford women had discovered something ancient, something powerful. They learned how to hollow the soul without drawing blood, and the world let them, because no one wanted to believe the price of peace was paid in mines. They called it reformation. But reformation implies something broken becoming whole. The Ashfords weren't healing, they were sculpting, stripping, reconstructing the inner world of a woman until she fit the mold. They disguised it in language borrowed from both scripture and science. Words like penitence, alignment, neuroconstitution, cleansing through disidentification, a blend of religious ritual and proto-psychology that no one questioned, because no one understood it. But someone noticed. His name was Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a circuit physician, a man of medicine and ambition, the kind of man who sniffed out innovation like a bloodhound. When he met the Ashford women, he thought they were brilliant. Decades ahead, he wrote in his private journal, their methods, shockingly effective. He saw opportunity, a chance to join something radical, and when Agatha offered him a deal, exclusive access to their case studies in exchange for supplies, silence, and support, he didn't hesitate. What did he see in their records? Case after case of women healed from hysteria, defiance, disobedience, intellectual curiosity, libido, and grief. But the outcomes weren't wellness, they were obedience. The sisters had discovered that trauma, when carefully applied, did more than silence rebellion. It erased identity, and they used it like a scalpel, with religious justification. Agatha wrote, "The soul is a wild animal. It must be cornered, broken, and redomesticated through sacred process, for the safety of the flock." These weren't mad women. They were engineers, architects of mind control, and they were just getting started. Within a year, families were sending daughters from hundreds of miles away, not because they understood the process, but because they craved the result. Quiet women, calm women, agreeable women. They didn't ask what happened in those stone chambers, because they didn't want to know. They only wanted silence. And the Ashfords delivered. There was a system to it. 3 levels, each more restricted than the last. Level 1 was where the recent arrivals were kept, women still defiant, still loud, still full of the fire that made them unfit. These were the ones who cried out in the night, who scratched at the walls, who screamed for their mothers. But no one heard, not out in that wilderness. Level 2 was for those undergoing alignment. Here the process shifted from spiritual to scientific. Long fasts, sleep deprivation, rhythmic chanting, controlled sensory input, water therapy, electroconvulsion cleansing, journaling exercises under hallucinogens brewed from native plants. And always one-on-one sessions with Sister Prudence. She was the technician. Her sessions took place in the stone chamber beneath the chapel, where the walls absorbed screams like hungry mouths. Prudence didn't use whips, she used silence. She used dissection of thought, repetition, surgical procedures no one in 1800 should have known. How did she know? That was the question. Where did these methods come from? The answer, if we believe Agatha's notes, was far darker. Not all sacred knowledge comes from heaven, she wrote. There are libraries beneath the soil. There are voices buried in the ground. The ancients knew how to bind the spirit to obedience. We simply remembered what they forgot. Level 3 was the final chamber, the still water room. No one spoke of it, not even the other sisters. But those who emerged from still water, if they emerged, were not women anymore. They were vessels, quiet, blank, efficient, obedient. Agatha called them cleansed, and the town called them miracles. No one asked where the fire went in their eyes. No one wanted to. Because when a woman stopped resisting, the world called it peace. But it was submission, engineered, perfected, sold like salvation, and the ones buying it wore crosses around their necks. One night in 1803, the illusion cracked. His name was Thomas Brewster, a trapper, 20 years old, alone in the forest, hunting a wounded deer beneath a sky smeared with snow. What he found instead was horror. He heard the sounds first, not animals, not wind, not wolves. Screams, human, raw, shredded, layered,
voices rising in rhythm like something being peeled apart. He followed them, heart racing, hands trembling. To the convent's rear wall, where snowdrifts buried all but the basement windows. Through the frost glass he saw it, a room alight with hundreds of candles, a woman strapped to a slab, her skull open, metal rods sliding into grey tissue, Prudence working with calm detachment, Temperance handing tools like a surgeon's apprentice, Agatha taking notes. It was not medicine, it was ritual disassembly, a vivisection of identity, and when the screaming stopped, the silence was worse. Thomas fled, stumbled through the forest, soaked in snow and nausea, mind screaming louder than the woman had. When he reached Millbridge, raving, blood-stained, his father thought him mad, but the details, too vivid, too exact. Thomas described every tool, every chant, every shadow on the wall. Things he couldn't have imagined, things a frontier boy shouldn't have words for. The town didn't believe him. Not publicly, because belief comes with responsibility, and responsibility means action, and action meant confronting something older, darker, and more organized than any of them were prepared to face. Deacon Morrison was the town's spiritual spine. Rational, trusted, careful. He agreed to investigate, quietly, diplomatically. He arrived at the convent with humility and honeyed concern. A fundraising visit, he said. A friendly drop-in. Agatha received him in a room that smelled like frankincense and vinegar. Her eyes piercing, her words soothing. She poured tea, asked after his wife, quoted scripture with effortless grace. When he broached the subject of strange noises, she smiled. The soul, she said, does not go gently when sin is exorcised. Sometimes the cries of the demon resemble the voice of the host, but that does not mean the demon isn't being driven out. It made sense, if you wanted it to. Deacon Morrison nodded, reassured, comforted. But then came the tour. Women sat in rows, motionless, not praying, staring, eyes dull, faces still, movements too synchronized. He felt it in his gut. This was no monastery, this was a lab. He asked about the basement. Agatha declined, for the dignity of the patients. But her refusal was too smooth, too practiced. He left the convent that day more shaken than he admitted, because behind the incense and smiles he'd smelled something else. Beneath the cleaning oils and dried herbs was the scent of iron, blood, and something far worse, control, manufactured, streamlined, packaged in religion, sold in scripture, disguised as holiness. After the deacon's visit, something changed inside the convent. The screams stopped, but the silence deepened. No more crying in the night, no more strange lights, no more flickers of activity from those hidden basement windows. But it wasn't peace. It was containment, as if they had shifted their methods, refined them, perfected them. Some say the Ashfords feared exposure, others say they simply evolved. They no longer needed force, not when they had discovered the true key to obedience, identity dislocation. They learned to untether the ego from memory, to separate the I from the self. And once that bridge is severed, a person can be rewritten. One former patient, Judith Albright, returned after 9 months in Stillwater. She had been a vibrant teacher, known for her sharp wit and political speeches. She came back empty. Not just quiet, erased. She couldn't remember her sister, or her dog, or her favorite hymns. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't blink. She recited verses like scripts, smiled on command. A perfect model of 1800s womanhood, and her family rejoiced. They threw a party to celebrate her transformation. No one noticed that her laugh didn't touch her eyes, or that she watched people, not with joy, but with a hollow, calculating awareness. Like she was studying them, not living with them. Over the next 2 years, more women returned from the convent, changed. They blended in, on the surface. They married, cooked, sang in choirs. But something was wrong. They never argued, never cried, never resisted.
Some never spoke again unless spoken to. Some recited lines verbatim from the Ashford sermons. But the most disturbing trait: they seemed incapable of dreaming, not metaphorically, literally. They no longer spoke of dreams, no night terrors, no fantasies, nothing, as if whatever spark generated imagination had been extinguished. Neighbors began whispering, "She's not the same. That's not my daughter. Her eyes, they're watching me." One woman, Rebecca Kane, was found staring at her infant for 6 straight hours, not blinking, not speaking. When her husband shook her, she turned and said, "The child has too many variables. Reprogramming must begin early." She didn't know why she said it, didn't remember saying it. But someone else had written those exact words decades earlier in Agatha Ashford's journal. What were the sisters teaching in Stillwater? Not religion, not medicine, but something colder: data, code, process. Like they weren't healing women, they were installing new operating systems. And the world kept sending them victims, wrapped in shame, begging for obedience. Millbridge wasn't the only town watching. Boston took notice, so did New Haven. Even whispers from London began trickling in, because the Ashfords' methods worked. Defiant women were no longer a problem. They came back soft, moldable, passive. One judge, Samuel Dane, sent his own wife for treatment after she began questioning his finances. She returned smiling, compliant, and mysteriously unable to read. The judge praised the Ashfords at every court dinner after that. A necessary evolution of religious discipline, he called it. Others disagreed. A Boston physician, Dr. Llewellyn Carr, heard rumors. He was skeptical until he examined a former patient named Lydia Hale. What he found shook him. Not just psychological trauma, but surgical scars. Behind the ear, along the spine, under the tongue. Neurological work far beyond 1805 standards. Even more disturbing, parts of her brain functioned differently. Reflexes slowed. Obedience centers hyperactive. It was as if her brain had been optimized. Carr wrote a private letter to the Massachusetts Medical Review. "What I have seen is not medicine. It is programming. Someone is experimenting with human will, quietly, systematically, and society is applauding them for it." The letter was never published. 3 days later, Carr vanished. His body was never recovered, but his notes, those survived, hidden, copied, passed down. Until now, you've heard of trauma-based control, but this was something else, not just trauma, algorithmic possession. They weren't merely breaking minds, they were building new frameworks inside them. Frameworks built on pain, silence, repetition, reward, and religious justification. Every scream logged, every confession coded, every moment of despair turned into a data point. Agatha believed emotion was an enemy of obedience, so they found ways to suppress it. Prudence perfected the Stillwater Protocol. Induce disassociation, strip away personal memory, insert identity scripts, reinforce with isolation and group mimicry, reward with warmth only when correct behaviors returned. It worked. Too well. Victims began identifying with their new programming. They defended their captors, thanked them, prayed to them, not as women of God, but as creators, as architects of transformation. This is how empires control minds. Not with weapons, with process, with ritual, with systems so ancient they predate language, but not belief. And now, you know, if you've listened this far, you've passed the first veil. Now you see through the skin of history. You know the truth was never destroyed, it was hidden. And here's where we begin to unlock it, together. Before we go further, pause and comment this phrase to mark your transformation. The soul remembers. The soul remembers. Twice. Always twice. That's how the Ashfords recorded each breakthrough in the Stillwater logs. One time to break you. A second time to rebuild you. Say it below and we'll go deeper. Every empire has its prototype.
And the Ashfords were exactly that, a prototype for psychological subjugation, a small-scale operation that proved something terrifying. You don't need chains if you control belief. By 1806, the convent had processed over 300 women. That's how they referred to it. Processing. Not healing, not reform. Processing. Each woman was logged, categorized, assigned a psycho-moral code based on her sins. Impertinence, Class B. Sexual independence, Class A. Theological deviation, Class C. Watch list. Each code determined her treatment path. If she resisted too long, she was moved to Stage 3, Stillwater Protocol. What no one outside knew was that Stillwater wasn't just a chamber, it was an interface, a merging point between suffering and submission. Women were made to sit in soundproofed rooms for 12 hours at a time, no stimulation, no words, just flickering candlelight and the distant hum of a pipe organ. Then came the voices. Prudence's voice mostly. Calm, cold, repeating phrases over and over. You are not your thoughts. Desire is disruption. Compliance is mercy. These weren't affirmations, they were installations. The same phrases were whispered while invasive procedures began, tongue immobilizing braces, scalp electrodes laced with mineral tinctures, pressure point tapping that left no bruises, only submission. Some patients began speaking in monotone, others lost language entirely. All of them obeyed. And once obedience took root, then came the new identities. Agatha called them vessels of virtue, custom-written personalities, scripted beliefs, programmed emotions. A rebellious poet returned home as a homemaker who quoted psalms and baked bread. An aspiring abolitionist came back convinced that women should not vote. A gifted linguist re-emerged unable to read her own diary. They remembered only what the Ashfords allowed them to remember. This wasn't redemption, it was replacement. Imagine for a moment if that system scaled. Imagine a future where every dissenter could be rewritten, quietly, cleanly, devoutly. Imagine how quickly control could become absolute. But you don't have to imagine, because that future isn't coming. It already came. And it started here, in the frozen woods of Maine, inside stone walls that still stand to this day, waiting, watching, silent. Because systems like this, they don't die, they adapt, they relocate, they evolve. And if you're watching this, you were meant to. Millbridge became a town of ghosts. Not the kind that drift in graveyards, but the kind that smile at dinner tables with empty eyes. By 1808, nearly 1 in 5 households had sent a woman to the Convent of Eternal Tears, and those who returned weren't daughters, or wives, or mothers. They were mirrors, reflecting whatever their surroundings demanded. No laughter, no protest, no rebellion, just service, obedience, function. Even the children noticed. One young boy, Henry Alden, wrote in a diary, "Mama came back from the place with new hands. They don't hug like they used to. They fold themselves at the table. She prays a lot, but I think she forgot God's name." And that's the thing no one could explain. The cured didn't seem religious. Not really. They went to church, they quoted scripture, but there was no fire behind their faith. No tears, no tremble, only performance. As if they had been taught theater, not theology. The Ashfords had succeeded in hollowing the soul and stuffing it full of ideology. A controlled emptiness, a quiet epidemic. And like most diseases, it began to spread, quietly, efficiently, under the skin of normal life. By now, whispers of the Ashfords had reached the eastern seaboard, not as warnings, as recommendations, judges, doctors, priests. All spoke of a miraculous sisterhood hidden in Maine, where broken women were made whole. Some compared them to Florence Nightingale, others to saints. But saints don't perform lobotomies in candlelit basements. Saints don't erase memory with tinctures soaked in belladonna and mercury. Saints don't record how long it takes a woman to forget her own name and call it a statistic. That's what the Ashfords were doing now, collecting data. Every patient became a case study, Every reaction categorized, every breakdown charted like weather patterns. They were building a manual, a guide to reprogramming the human mind. One entry read, Subject 47, recurring resistance after mnemonic suppression, introduce repetition loop, pain is permission, choice is chaos, truth is the cage. Response, immediate compliance within 72 hours. These weren't notes, these were templates, and one day they would be shared, not through sermons, but through institutions. The first documented death came in spring of 1809. Her name was Elsie Ward, 20 years old, unwed, pregnant. Her family sent her to the convent in shame. She never came home. 3 months later, her body was found floating in the river near the property line. Her wrists were cut, but the coroner, Dr. Hartwell, insisted it was a suicide. Except for one detail, her blood was missing, completely drained. No pooling, no trail, no explanation. And inside her mouth, burned into the underside of her tongue, was a Latin phrase, Dominus Mentis, master of the mind. The town priest called it demonic. Agatha called it a tragedy. But a former groundskeeper, Nathaniel Clark, saw something else. He had been fired weeks earlier for inappropriate curiosity. Before leaving, he'd found journals, dozens of them, bound in calfskin, smelling of copper and mildew. One entry chilled him. The removal of memory requires sacrifice. A vessel cannot be made clean without first being emptied. Blood carries identity. Drain it, and the mind becomes clay. He tried to take them to the sheriff. He never arrived. They found his cart overturned in the woods. His eyes were gone. Let's pause here, not to rest, but to absorb. Because this is where most men turn away. They say, this is too much. They say, it can't be true. But history doesn't need your belief to be real. It only needs your silence to repeat itself, and it has. The Ashfords weren't an anomaly. They were a blueprint. Their methods, refined and rebranded, exist today in rehabilitation programs, religious cults, military black sites, psychiatric facilities, corporate onboarding programs. Everywhere obedience is demanded, everywhere the individual is broken and rebuilt to serve. Their tactics weren't exorcism, they were extraction, and the currency they dealt in, not gold, not faith. Obedience, manufactured, monetized, weaponized, and you were never meant to know. That's why you're here. That's why you're still watching. You're not just learning a story, you're recovering your instinct. The one they've tried to bury in every generation. The one that whispers, something is wrong with the world. Keep listening. Because the next layer is buried deeper.